I'm Natalia Lobach, and this is Change Course. Information is currency. One of the ways that you can figure out how power is distributed and aggregated in an organization that you are seeking to change is by looking at how information flows between people, departments, entities, who has the information, and what are the gatekeeping practices that they put into place or that exist to restrict or to control access to information. In this modern world, information is currency. It's just as powerful as revenue, as relationships, and as the other ways that people can aggregate power in an organization. So a couple different ways that I see this happening. Power gets aggregated because of access to either resources or the ability to make decisions. So that's why in connected change, we have power, influence, and you also have politics as sort of those three key pieces that make up our understanding of power structure. In organizations, you always have this dynamic where people seek to gain power. And people do that through influence and using influence through their position in the organization or through authoritative power, and then also through their activities and actions, which we can talk about as politics. There are a few specific ways that I commonly see power being aggregated in an organization. One of the ways is through revenues. So if you're one of the people who is on top of that revenue stream, you are the person or one of the people who is controlling it, who is responsible for it, who has a lot of authority in the organization around revenue generation. You're the one who's creating the money to pay the bills of the organization. Therefore, you have a lot of power, and you'll see that reflected in the way that the organization responds to questions about how they're running, how they're doing things, and the revenue that's being generated. The risk here is that when things are good, when you're in a feast, you have a lot of power. When it's a famine situation or maybe things aren't going as well, you can see that power dynamic shift. And so in this position, you're very much dependent upon some of those external circumstances. The other way that I see it happening is through relationships. So in an organization, if you are somebody who has relationships with key external decision makers, you have relationships with powerful people, both in and outside the organization. If that is part of the lifeblood of your organization, if that is part of what makes it run, you are therefore you're seen as a very powerful person. And the organization the way that people react and respond within the organization will reflect that power locus. The third way is information. And this one I see increasing in organizations as we move more into digitally enabled organizations, data-driven decision-making, and using data and information as key drivers in the organization. The way that I see this happening is that the people who are in charge of the information in the organization, whether it's information that directly impacts revenue generation, operations, or relationships, as depending on how the organization is set up, the people who hold the keys to the information vault are starting to gain more power. And with any aggregation of resource, now, as I'm talking about this, revenue generation, revenue is a resource in the organization. Money is a resource in the organization. Relationships are resources. The ability to influence key decision makers, that's a resource. Information is the same. It's a resource as well. Now, revenue is quantifiable. I mean, you can count it, dollars and cents, right? But the power of relationships and the power of information is really ethereal. It comes from something else. It comes from the ability to influence or the ability to make things happen or have certain outcomes reached because you have a specific resource. Information in the organization is knowledge. So institutional knowledge, that's something different. So people who understand the organization, the history, the way of working, all of that, they have that deep historical knowledge of the organization. That's different. What I'm talking about is information, which is just really your organization's core data set. So, very interesting. As I'm working with a client recently, and I've seen this pattern repeated many, many, many times. One of the key stakeholders that we need in this change is the group of people that hold the information in the organization. The way that these individuals or this department sits in the organization is that they directly impact operations. So there is a clearinghouse or a process that happens that then enables the operational component or the operational activity of the organization that then also leads into revenue generation. The information storehouse in this organization is not dependent on relationships and is not them, they aren't themselves revenue generating. But what we do see is that there is a gatekeeping, there is a protection activity that is happening with the information. So one of the patterns that I notice with this is around how it shows up in change and how it shows up in resistance. Remember, in connected change, we don't talk about individuals being resistant to change. It's really not something that drives organizational level change. Sure, at an individual level, we all have resistance, change resistance, and I've talked at length about why that happens and why resistance shows up for us on a personal level when we encounter change. At an organizational level, resistance has more to do with the organizational system and the way things are set up and the way things work. Remember, organizational systems are there to support the purpose and the strategy of the organization. That vision that we talk about. Why does the organization exist? What does it do? What is the purpose of it? If the purpose of the organization is to make widgets, to make candy canes, to make whatever, that is the purpose of the organization. And you'll see that the organizational structure and the systems that are built will reflect that. When you have an organization that relies heavily on information as part of that execution, that value stream, that flow, what you see is that there is a need by the individuals in that, or by the system itself, if there is a need or an interest to aggregate power, then you'll see resistance showing up in the system at that point. So there's a couple different ways to look at this. in organizations, typically structures work where you have your revenue generation and whatever it is, the activities and the value stream that's supporting the purpose of the organization. So in organizations that are there to make money, you'll see that in the revenue generation part. For organizations that are there to provide a service, you'll see that in the service delivery arm. So remember, those are two different things. And I'll go into another podcast to explain the difference in these two types of organizations. But really, when you're looking at purpose, you're either delivering something or you're making something. So you got two choices, right? When you are looking at that lifeblood piece of the organization, the delivering something or the making of something, you also have a number of other organizational functions that serve or support that aim or that goal. So that's why organizations tend to have fairly similar structures. You see the main thing that the organization does, and then you support that with with a bunch of other functions. Supply chain, finance, human resources, internal administration, facility management, whatever it is. Any organization, you can split it into two, basically. Who's doing the stuff and who's delivering the thing, and then all of the other pieces that come along to support that. In organizations, information, depending on where it's held in the organization, so it could be information services, IT, there's a number of other functions that use information in order to make the stuff of the organization happen. And that could be project management. It could be, there's a bunch of different ways that you can describe it. This function of the organization is a support function. This is very important to remember. And so organizations that work well, you see this support function being resourced adequately. You see the support function being able to expedite or smooth the path of revenue generation or service delivery in an organization. In organizations that don't work well, you see this as a point of resistance. Because information is currency, it's a double-edged sword. You have the ability to really help the organization, and you're important and you're integral to that flow of either revenue or service. But the flip side is that information is another way that an organization can aggregate power, or people or departments or groups in the organization can aggregate power. In organizations where I see some of this change resistance, this is where I often see problems in the way the organization is structured, the system of the organization, and then you see that change resistance showing up. So I've talked a lot about the theory. I'm going to get really specific here. So I can't talk about my current client, but I can talk about a past one because this is something I've seen many times over. So I worked in a service delivery organization, and one of the areas of the organization that was integral to the service delivery was information. And the information in this case was around a number of clients who were in the program and their participation in the program, and then looking at, really it was a client, like a client resource management system that was a CRM system that was housing all of this client data and client information. Because this was a service delivery organization, we were looking at the total population of potential clients. And we were also trying to figure out what was our reach, like how many people were being reached by this program. Could we increase reach? Was there a way to generate more participation? Were we seeing a lot of repeat customers, as an example? So because this was not a revenue generating organization, this was service delivery, we were looking at that client population and how could we get deeper into what was happening with that client population. So I'd been asked to come in and do some very specific work around developing we were developing a new program that was going to be rolling out. And we had to look at what was the component of existing clients who could then move into this new program, and what would be the additional reach of new potential clients from our full market that might be willing to join us in this new program. And this is where we started to run into barriers. Why? Because there was a specific department who was responsible for holding this information, and this department was not interested in sharing that information. They were not interested in losing the power that came from hoarding that information and from keeping the access to that information to a very small group of people. So when you see this pattern show up in organizations, this is where you have to start working through the power structure and really thinking about how you're strategically going to impact or influence change in the organization when you have this very strong locus of power. So in this case, what we did was we worked with the authoritative structure within the organization. One of our key stakeholders was the head of this department, who was not interested in participating for various reasons, which I'll get into. And what we had to do was actually use the individuals who were above this person in the organizational structure to influence downwards and say, no, you really need to participate. What we ended up getting was not participation of this individual. It was just not on the table. This person was refusing to participate. And I've talked a little bit about, yes, individual resistance does show up occasionally. But, interestingly, and you can see this pattern again and again and again, what this person was hoping to do was become a pundit. They were hoping to challenge and undermine any of the results or conclusions that we came to through understanding this new program. So what we did get was access to the information. And so that's all we needed, was just access to the information. And this is why this is such a difficult thing. This is why people who hoard or who hold onto information in order to aggregate power don't want you to have access to the information, because once you have access to the information, there are tools abound. Very smart data analysts abound. It's very easy to figure out how to use the information once you have access to it. So access to information is one of the barriers you'll often see in a power structure. Once we had access to this information, all of a sudden we were able to do quite amazing things with it. And the thing that we discovered was that there were some problems with the internal data of the organization, having to do with some decisions that this department head had made, and some of their practices, they weren't really best practice. And it turned out that there were some double counting of individuals who were in the program versus not in the program. And so as we started to uncover some of these problems, this is where we saw resistance really starting to kick in, because now we understood why the individual that was in charge of this information and had been tasked with information stewardship and setting up and doing all of this work with the information and the data of the organization, we understood why they were gatekeeping so furiously, why they were not wanting others to have access, because they were, rightfully so, quite cautious or fearful of scrutiny. So now that we understand the motivation in this case, we can see why and what was happening and why. How we overcame it, again, like I said, we worked with the internal power structure of the organization And this ended up being very emotional. It ended up being very, very difficult. Parts of it were very hard to navigate because of this individual and their resistance to change, and the fact that they had aggregated a significant amount of power around information and around information flow in the organization. You couldn't get information in this organization without going through this person. Every person in their department wouldn't respond to you. They would refuse to respond to you. The only way you could get a response was by going to the department head. Everything was centralized through the department head. And of course, they always used the excuse that they didn't have enough time, that they were so busy that they couldn't get to all of their responses. I see this behavior over and over and over again. This isn't new, but it is a behavior pattern that you're probably going to encounter in similar organizations. Too busy, can't get to it, I'm overworked, I need more staff. The issue is not about not having enough people to do the work. In fact, there was also an interesting thing happening within the department where there was delegation to a degree that the work was very parsed out. And so the way that this department head or individual had aggregated and centralized the core information and the power into them was that no other person in the department had the end-to-end view of the information. No other person in the department had the depth of knowledge that this one individual had. Because our change initiative exposed these weaknesses, the organization made changes later on about how the structure of the organization helped better serve this function. And so there were changes made around the department head, the scope, and then also bringing in a few other people at that level who would have that more broad scope and understanding of that information flow within the organization and that information itself and the data. The change itself was successful, but what we had to do in order to make it successful and make it stick was actually let it go. So the credit and who was in charge of the change had to be flexible. We couldn't take full credit in order for the change to be successful. We had to let this department head actually take the credit and be the one who was, quote unquote, responsible for the information that we uncovered, the new program, all of that. They were the ones that had to be sitting at the head of it. They were the ones who needed for themselves and, for reasons of power to be the ones who owned it. And so we had to let it go. And that was actually really hard for the person that I was working with at the time to let go of that, to let somebody else be the owner and the driver of this change, that, it wasn't the change leader. And that's an interesting piece as well when you're working with these very difficult power dynamics, that often letting go of your own perception or your own need for power, for your own need for accountability and ownership, actually sets the change in motion and sets it up for success in some cases. But you've also got to be ready to let go of that. The last thing I wanted to mention is some of the behaviors that we noticed. And this is getting really, really specific. So if you're dealing with a situation and you think it kind of might be like this, these are some of the behaviors that you're going to see. Like I said, complaining about understaffing, too much work, not enough time. I cannot meet your information request because I have 50 other things that I need to be doing. So it's always the downplaying of importance of requests that come to the door and preserving and protecting whatever it is that function or group who's holding the information hostage in some cases will do in order to protect their own power. So maybe it is that they're serving one or two key core individuals in the organization, or they're serving very specific functions and they don't want to erode that And so they will refuse any other incumbent requests or any other incumbent needs because they're preserving those powerful relationships using the information. You may also see things like centralization. So refusing to participate, only allowing one central individual or person to participate. We see this a lot. And it's potentially fear-driven. It's potentially a knowledge-sharing issue where individuals at various other levels in that particular group don't have the knowledge, which is strategic, by the way, that they don't have the knowledge to be able to participate in other initiatives, that it always comes down to the same person. So you see centralization. You're also going to see resistant behaviors like not showing up to meetings or not showing up to interactions, refusing to speak to the change leader or people on the change program, having to jump through hoops in order to get time in that person's calendar, things like that. You'll notice that as well. Also, just sometimes they're just absent. So you'll see a really good game in terms of, I'm going to be there, I'm going to participate, I'm going to do this or that. And then there's just an absence. They just don't come to the table. They just don't show up. You can't find them. They're nowhere. Impossible to locate. That kind of stuff as well. That kind of behavior. And again, it's all around that protection of the information and wanting to keep and contain that power. The truth is you do need these individuals or these groups at the table. And so one of the best ways that I've found, there's two ways that I typically facilitate this. One is by using, like I said, the power structure around this person. So in an authoritative structure, there are going to be others who this person responds and reacts to. You can also look at who they're feeding or influencing and work with those individuals to help you get this person to the table. So power, again, looking at the power structure, and then influence, looking at who is valuable to them and getting them to help you. The second way that I do it is sometimes I let it go and I say, okay, fine. If you don't want to be at the table, then don't be at the table. But what happens is you get to a certain point in the initiative where their participation or non-participation becomes an issue. And then you've got to start to raise the alarm. And if you're dealing with depending on the personality, you're going to have to pick your strategy. But this one is one to work with when you maybe have somebody who really needs to feel important when they're coming to the table. Instead of using influence or authority to help them come to the table, what you do is you create that sense of importance or that sense of issue, that sense of drama that comes with them not being there, such that when they do arrive, they are coming in as a very important stakeholder. So you're using the situation to help them feel like their power is still very elevated. So it's a little bit of timing, it's a little bit of art, and looking at the personal and group dynamics to figure out what the best strategy is. A lot of people will say that you can use trust building or trying to build a relationship as a strategy. I find sometimes this works. It really depends on the person and it really depends on the situation. Sometimes this works. Other times this can be a total waste of time. So I'm speaking fairly plainly, but yeah, like you really want to pick your strategy here. And relationship building, yes, absolutely. But I'm also saying that when you are using your other two strategies, it's not that you're also like you're abandoning relationship building, trust building. You're not abandoning those things. You're still doing them at the same time, but you're doing them with a purpose. So that's a really important point as well. When those individuals do finally come to the table and want to participate and be an active part of the change, you're not chastising. You're not saying you should have been here before. You're not saying, oh, where were you this whole time? Or we've done all this work and now you're finally here. No, you're not looking at it from a negative point of view. You're looking at it from an inclusive and a positive point of view to say, we're happy you're here. We really need your help. So just remember that. This isn't about you as a change manager trying to play or be a part of the power structure or the power dynamics in the organization. No, you're not a part of that. You're doing things differently, but you do need to be aware of it and work with it to help you be successful. But you're not going to be like everybody else. You're not going to behave in that way. You've always got to go with that mindset and that goal to be inclusive. And the reason why you're bringing people to the table is because you want their input and their participation. And because, yes, just like everybody else who's coming, they're important too. So I hope this has been helpful and a way to think about how power shows up in organizations, especially around information. And I am sure that you're going to be seeing this a lot more in the organizations that you're working with, as I have. I've seen this now more and more and more over the last few years and even over the last few months. So with that, good luck. And I hope this was helpful today. And all the best to you as you work through your change and changing course. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, I invite you to like, share, rate, and subscribe because it helps others find us. Change Course is brought to you by Charthouse Advisory Services and ConnectedChange.com. Our music is Levity by Emily Clausen. Show notes have moved. We're now at ConnectedChange.com. So visit us there under the Change Course podcast page, and you'll find a list of all the resources that I've mentioned here today. While you're visiting us, sign up for the Change Navigator newsletter. You'll keep on top of all things change, and every month we are sharing exclusive content and resources only with our subscribers. So don't miss out. Sign up at ConnectedChange.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to change course.